In this ABC lab, we'll be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 to 17. Therefore, I urge you to imitate me. For this reason I have sent to you Timothy, my son, whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord. He will remind you of my way of life in Christ Jesus, which agrees with what I teach everywhere in every church. Let's start with step 1. Read the passage, noting observations from the text. My first observation is that there are lots of personal pronouns. There's I, me, my, first person singular. There's you, second person plural, and he, third person singular. In fact, there are 11 personal pronouns referring to 2 individuals and 1 group of people. Who are they? Well, we know from the start of 1 Corinthians that the I must be Paul and the you are the Christians in Corinth. And verse 17 tells us the he is Timothy. And we learn a bit more about Timothy. He is the son whom I love. Clearly, he and Paul have a very close relationship. Timothy knows Paul very well. And Timothy is faithful in the Lord. He is a trustworthy gospel worker alongside Paul. My second observation is that there are also lots of verbs. Verse 16, urge. Verse 17, sent, remind, and teach. These verbs tell me what the 3 identified here are doing or are to do. So Paul is urging the Corinthians to do something, that is, to imitate him. Paul is also sending Timothy to the Corinthian church. And Timothy will be reminding the Corinthians about Paul's way of life in Christ Jesus, the same as what Paul has been teaching in all the other churches. So we've considered some observations. Now let's move to step 2. How are these observations related to each other? A few words particularly help us to see the connections. Therefore, for this reason, and which. Therefore, at the beginning of verse 16, points us back to the basis for why Paul is urging the Corinthian Christians to imitate him. In verse 15, Paul reminds the Corinthians that since he was the one who first preached the gospel to them, he has the special role of being as a father to them, and so therefore he has the right to call them to follow his example. The therefore also helps us to see what it is the Corinthians are to imitate. It reminds us of the previous 3.5 chapters, where Paul's message has been Christ crucified, and his life of sacrifice and hardship for the gospel has reflected this message. This is the example the Corinthians are to copy. For this reason points us to the relationship between verses 16 and 17. Why is Paul sending Timothy to the Corinthians? Because Paul wants the Corinthians to imitate him, and so they will need someone who knows Paul's teaching and life well, and they can trust. Clearly, Timothy is the best man to remind the Corinthians about what they appear to have forgotten. And finally, which, in verse 17, connects what Paul is urging the Corinthian Christians to do with what Paul has been teaching in all the churches he has planted and visited. Paul's instruction to them is no different to what he expects of others. Christ crucified should be the central message and pattern of living for every Christian. The third R, and the final one we'll look at, is reveal. What main point is revealed? From what we've observed, it seems to be this. The Corinthians are to follow Paul's example, preaching and living Christ crucified, as are all Christians everywhere.